vast numbers of US law enforcement agents across Mexico being able to be part of on-the-ground operations, at least in an observer role, being able to be part of joint fusion intelligence centers, so that we also have eyes and can prompt some of the necessary cleanup of law enforcement and military institutions in Mexico. This is a very hard task. The Mexican government doesn't want it. But this is what I would be focusing my diplomacy on, not the satisfaction of a missile strike, but on bringing U.S. law enforcement back in a sustainable way to Mexico, and telling the Mexican government, this is not just for us. This is not only a payoff for tariffs. This is in the interest of your state, your people.
How can I help? How can I be useful in ending needless suffering? Do not be afraid of work that has no end.
We have to organize a social movement.
We have an opportunity to lead by example versus just talking, hot air.
I think the more people in this fight, the more we grow. Eventually it could change. The people are the ones that can make the change.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Change Agents, an Ironclad original presented by Firecracker Farm. Today, we're going to be talking about the fentanyl crisis in the United States. Unless you have been living under a rock, and even if you have been living under a rock, you have probably heard the term fentanyl. It ties into our war against drugs. The jury, I think, is back on whether or not we have won that particular war. But today, we're going to talk with geopolitical expert Vanda Brown, discussing the current fight against the fentanyl crisis in the United States, where it originates from, the geopolitical environment that terminates in fentanyl coming across our border, what can be done with China, what can be done with Mexico, and what could the U.S. do by itself unilaterally to try to tackle this issue and reduce the lethality and overdoses in this country. Let's get into it. When did you first start digging into the subject of fentanyl? And I'll be honest, it's not, I want people to live their life the way that they want to. The war on drugs, I think we could probably say, has been lost at this point. I'm not saying that the move would be to legalize everything, even though there is an argument for that. People are going to use it, whether it's legal or illegal. But I definitely didn't have my finger on the pulse of the drug war. But I didn't start hearing about fentanyl, I'm going to say, until probably the last 5 years or so. And I started hearing about it and I live in northwestern Montana. I live 60 miles from the Canadian border. And I started hearing about it from my law enforcement friends, from the perspective of having to Narcan people. That's where I first heard it, specifically where I lived. I have family in San Diego. I had heard about it a little bit more there, which would make sense if they are bringing it across the southern border and going up the West Coast. But now where I live, multiple boxes of Narcan in every police and sheriff vehicle. Every officer that I talk to deals with it in some way, whether it's giving somebody Narcan or finding fentanyl on the street, finding pills that are laced with fentanyl. It's very forward facing. So for me, it was in the last 5 years. I'm curious, when did you start hearing the word fentanyl? When did it hit your radar?
Several years before that, but I think your time frame around 5 years ago is indeed where it got on the radar screen of the public at large. So I have been looking at illegal economies like drug markets my entire professional career, which I'm sad to say at this point is some good 20 years. And at the time, the drugs have evolved in various ways. But we have seen some very dramatic shifts. So one very dramatic shift was the spread of opioid use disorder in the United States as a result of unscrupulous, really egregious behavior of US pharmaceutical companies. A second big shift is a global revolution in synthetic drugs that is really sweeping the world. And it has its different manifestations in different parts of the world. But in general, drug markets are evolving towards synthetic drugs because they are much more potent, much easier to produce, and they don't require the control of territories So you want to be running a large heroin empire or cocaine empire, you need a lot of land. And hence you need to be looking at actors and places with poor governance. So be that Afghanistan, where of course US war on terrorism was deeply intertwined with drugs, or places like Colombia. Now, if you're making investments in synthetic drugs, you avoid all of these problems, and your law enforcement evasion needs are much simplified. So many fewer people, much less cargo to move, much more potent, immense possibility to supply the drugs. So, you mentioned Montana, and I would imagine that your exposure for a long time was in meth markets. For a long time, Montana has been,
still is. They
Absolutely.
kind of go hand in hand. Talking to my law enforcement buddies,
Absolutely,
it's meth for the up, and then I mean, instead of maybe going to sleep, which I don't know if that's even possible on meth, they use fentanyl related drugs for the down. So they're kind of balancing their up and down.
That's one of them. And, also, frankly, we are seeing and have been seeing a lot of mixing of fentanyl into all kinds of drugs, which is part of the story on how this becomes an issue about 5 years ago, where folks are focusing on it. So let me give our listeners a bit of the story of how the fentanyl market has spread around the US. And maybe later on, we can talk about how synthetic opioids like fentanyl, but also others, are spreading beyond North America to other parts of the world.
Fantastic.
So, in the US, you have the big problem of people developing opioid use disorders because they were given bagfuls of oxy for any kind of injury, not just terminally ill patients with serious pain, like from cancer, but sprained ankle, pulled tooth, here is a bag full of oxy. And so many people all of a sudden got opioid use disorder, which is not something that was traditional in US drug markets. US drug markets forever was around meth and around coke. But all of a sudden you have these people all addicted to oxy. And this would be not just your kind of typical recreational drug experimentation, folks in their teenage years, college, high school, experimenting with drugs, some of whom will develop substance use disorder, many of whom won't. The traditional rule has been like 20% will develop substance use disorder as a chronic illness, 80% will be able to use drugs safely and eventually will stop using drugs. So, but the legal supply of oxycodone without any kind of restraint, really with every regulatory body being captured by pharmaceutical companies such as Purdue, was now exposing everyone from high school athletes coming in with a sprained ankle to grandmothers in their 70s dealing with arthritis, to one-time patient having a molar extracted, to vast amounts of thebaine-based drugs like oxycodone that got them addicted. Eventually, 15 years later, US becomes aware of the problem that's been unleashed, and there is this massive substance use disorder. And so it turns off the legal supply of the drugs. It tells companies like Purdue, no, you cannot be doing this anymore. Lawsuits come, the medical guidance is issued, only so much exposure to drugs like oxycodone. So, you can no longer walk into a CVS, or at least legitimate pharmaceutical companies like CVS, and say, give me 200 pills of oxycodone. But all the people who are who have developed substance use disorder, unprecedented numbers of people whom an illegal market could never suck in at this level. An illegal market could never create this level of addiction, now need to feed the habit. And so first they turn to heroin that is brought by the Mexican cartels. And then something happens in 2012 and 2013, and that is the arrival of fentanyl. And originally, it starts arriving from China, from Chinese brokers, chemical companies, essentially directly to dealers. Sometimes directly to users, but often directly to users. So it's bypassing large criminal organizations. These would be chemical companies, brokers, networks, sometimes shady, sometimes not so shady, but selling directly to drug dealers in the US. And so fentanyl starts circulating in drug markets, and at first is heavily concentrated along the Atlantic coast. Now, as this starts circulating, the Mexican cartels, the Sinaloa cartel and Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, take notice. They've been dominating the US drug market. They are bringing in heroin, and you see big expansion of opium poppy in Mexico with new cultivation and production of heroin. They're bringing cocaine. But all of a sudden, there are these outsiders bringing in these weird drugs, and they are starting to circulate in the market, and dealers are buying it. So the cartels have a choice. They could try to shoot out those local dealers who are buying from the Chinese, something they would likely do in Mexico. But in the US, they act without such resort to violence. Actually, the Mexican cartels in the US are very nonviolent, even as they are immensely violent in Mexico, because they fear US law enforcement. So they don't go for the option, shoot out the dealers, and instead they jump on the bandwagon and fentanyl. And it is really around 2015, 2016, when the chapitos of the Sinaloa cartel, the Jalisco Nueva Generación cartel, makes the decision to enter the fentanyl market, develop their connections with Chinese brokers, at first bringing in fully finished fentanyl, eventually bringing in precursors to Mexico and cooking it, that it starts really spreading across the US. And they also, along with dealers, start mixing fentanyl into everything, into cocaine, into methamphetamine, and this drives addiction vastly. And it also drives vastly overdose, because what is so different about synthetic opioids is their potency. So the DEA has a campaign called One Pill Can Kill, and that's not a lie, that's not an exaggeration. One pill can literally kill. And indeed, a lot of the overdose death rates are because first-time users thinking they're scoring coke or thinking they're scoring meth, or in some cases even cannabis products, end up with something laced with fentanyl, and they overdose on it and die, unless they have access to overdose medication like naloxone, like Narcan. And the other interesting dimension I'll wrap up here is the spread of fentanyl westward is actually quite gradual. So by 2015, 2016, 2017, the East Coast or eastern part of the US, really much of eastern US, east of Mississippi, is saturated by fentanyl. But there's very, very little west of the Mississippi. And it's only around 2019, 2020, where the big jump is for fentanyl supply networks to start bringing fentanyl everywhere, from California to Washington to Montana. So today in the US, we are really in a place where there is no more place that's fentanyl free.
It's interesting they started on the East Coast, given just the geography of the United States, like where I live. If you're going to come from mainland Mexico, it's essentially due north. And again, talking to my law enforcement friends, the route of travel, it's well known and established. It basically goes up Highway 5, up the West Coast to Spokane or Seattle or source cities, and then it comes inward. That seems a little bit more direct than starting with the East Coast. What route of travel was it taking to get from Mexico to the East Coast?
Well, so there are these many mysteries, right, that we don't really understand why the drug trafficking organizations make some decisions and not others. Same, why was there this real time lag between the East and West Coast at all? Why was there this barrier for several years of the Mississippi River? But lots of it was coming through Texas or through Miami and heading up north, literally along the East Coast, so Miami, DC, Philadelphia, Boston, that route. I think some of it really has to do with pre-existing established networks they have. But we have to remember that a lot of the fentanyl at first starts coming in directly from China. And so very likely you just have idiosyncratic connections between particular dealers in places like Philadelphia, New York, that have connections to Chinese brokers, and they start to bringing in. And the Mexican cartels are essentially mapping on those pre-existing networks and relations. But we're seeing something, almost identical now happening with xylazine. So xylazine is a tranquilizer. It's a drug that causes very bad morbidity effects. People develop necrotic tissue often to such an extent that it leads to amputations of their arms and legs, really horrific condition for people to live in. At the same time, bizarrely, it might be helping to reduce fentanyl overdose deaths, something we can talk about, because for the first time since late 2023, we're seeing fentanyl deaths going down, and we can talk about why and how and what this means for policy. But back to the xylazine story, it's emerged in exactly the same space where fentanyl emerged on the East Coast. So kind of Philadelphia was the hotspot, perhaps because of linkages to Puerto Rican dealers who have been using the drugs and selling it in Puerto Rico for a longer time, mapped onto Chinese suppliers once again, and then spread out of Philadelphia up and down the East Coast, and now gradual spread westward. So, just almost an analogous pattern to the way fentanyl was spreading across the U.S.
Ladies and gentlemen, do you need a gift idea for somebody that you love, or do you just want to treat yourself? Well, I have one for you. Firecracker Farm Hot Salt is an absolutely awesome gift. It is delicious, it's handcrafted, it's beautifully packaged, and it's unlike anything else that is out there. Everybody who tries it absolutely loves it. Firecracker Farm has different flavors and heat levels like Pineapple Express, and hotter stuff if that's what you're into, and their limited run buddy batches, the Apocalypto and Snake Eater. There's something for everybody. It's made with love, and a percentage of every sales goes to OP300 and the Pipe Hitter Foundation. There is one drawback, and that is you might not be able to get it. Firecracker Farm is a very small family business, and Alex can only make so much at a time. So there is a chance that they're going to run out. And once you get your hands on one of these grinders, you're going to understand exactly why they can't make them in batches. This is a handcrafted grinder with an amazing salt inside of it. If cost is your main concern, worry not. There are hundreds of thousands of servings per package, which is way cheaper than any sauce, and it's not going to over flavor like a lot of sauces traditionally do. If you are ready to upgrade your culinary game and get your hands on one of these amazing grinders yourself, use the code Ironclad, all one word, all capital, to get 15% off your first order at firecracker.farm. I'm assuming that the cartel is aware of the overdose risk associated with fentanyl. Is there, I can't say that I've ever heard of a cartel being a benevolent organization really caring about the future, or the health of the end state user. Do they just not care that it is so lethal because it is so addictive? They're, about 150 to 200,000 deaths, in the past few years on average inside of the United States. To them, is that just the cost of business? Like, screw it, those people are going to die, but it's so addictive, we'll gain more customers anyway?
That has been the calculation, but it was a change in calculation. So, and this is really interesting and fascinating part of the story. And we have some quite significant insights that come from U.S. law enforcement agencies and the wiretaps and indictments that have come out. So the cartels have been going through their change, and the old generation, folks like El Mayo and El Chapo, while hardly being nice people, acted with some restraints. And one of the restraints, even the younger generation, the sons of El Chapo, known as the Chapitos, the sons of El Mayo, have acted with, is not being very violent in the US. But with respect to fentanyl, they suspended this fear of US law enforcement, or suspended the understanding that if they started causing, through whatever means, a lot of deaths in the US, that would have real repercussions. And so some of the indictments of the Chapitos that the Department of Justice put out in the spring of 2023 show these extraordinary conversations in which they talk about the lethality. They are, for example, discussing a particularly high potency batch of fentanyl that they know will kill people, something they could just stop that's extraordinarily cheap for them to replace. And they say, oh, let's just send it anyway. It doesn't matter how many people we kill in the US because we will get so many more people addicted. Then they talk about the desire to create streets of American junkies. Now, these wiretaps and the subsequent focus of the Biden administration on, or I'm saying these wiretaps, these indictments that were published that presumably have come out of wiretap information, really stimulated the Biden administration to make the Chapitos the #1 enemy, criminal enemy of the United States, and apply all pressure by US law enforcement agencies to go after the Sinaloa cartel and particularly the Chapitos branch. And this led to very fascinating things. So I mentioned earlier that deaths are down in the US from late 2023. There are many factors for that, little definite understanding or judgment as to what's driving it. In my view, the most important factor is far greater availability of naloxone, Narcan, and also far greater availability of long-term medications such as buprenorphine. So users are not using as frequently, and if they overdose, they can reverse the overdose, or first responders can overdose. But we're also seeing that the potency of fentanyl has declined. Purity is down. And that suggests that something is happening with supply. It could be that seizures are more effective, certainly something the Biden administration put a lot of effort at the US-Mexico border. But it could also be that you have changes in the behavior of the Chapitos themselves. So I was in Sinaloa in June 2023, just around the first time when you started seeing corpses appearing around the city of Culiacan, the capital of Sinaloa and the headquarters of the Sinaloa cartel, presumably on a big pile of fentanyl. I mean, you would see these pictures. I was in the city at the time. I wasn't going to go and lick the pills to see whether it's fentanyl or not. But the narco manta saying that the Chapitos have banned the production of fentanyl. And I was very skeptical about the claims. I went back there several months later, late in 2023, and I continued hearing that there is in place a ban on fentanyl production by the Chapitos, by the Sinaloa cartel branch, and that cooks, former fentanyl cooks, are without work, that there is a rise in predatory criminality on the street because many people who had been employed in production are now out of jobs. And I was really skeptical that the Chapitos would make the decision not to produce fentanyl, but thought that it was possible that they were moving production out of their headquarters, out of Sinaloa, out of Culiacan, both closer to the US-Mexico border, as well as south to places like Chiapas and Guatemala, because they wanted to reduce law enforcement pressure on them. The US had at that point, through the Mexican government, arrested Ovidio Guzman, one of the four Chapito, one of the four sons of El Chapo. There were arrests of many of the sicarios, including the leader of the sicario for the Chapitos. So there was a lot of activity and a lot of pressure by the US government to make life for the Chapitos in their home base as uncomfortable as possible and to arrest as many of them as possible. And in my view, it's very possible that they were seeking to reduce the US law enforcement pressure. They're moving production elsewhere. And they also started issuing those notices and kind of statements through their lawyers saying, we are not cooking fentanyl, we are being misunderstood, kind of public propaganda communications efforts, once again to say, we get the message, we're pulling back. In the spring of this year, the Drug Enforcement Administration issued its assessment saying they did not believe that the Chapitos shut down fentanyl production. They still believe that Sinaloa was in fentanyl production. And that would be my expectation as well. But I think it's an intriguing possibility that they would be sending less lethal fentanyl, because finally they understand that US will go after them without any kind of constraint and with all prioritization if death numbers in the US remain as high as they are. And of course, we have seen, other fascinating developments. One of the other chapitos, Joaquim, handing himself over to US authorities in July of 2024, kidnapping his god uncle, El Mayo, from the rival branch of the Sinaloa cartel and bringing him to US law enforcement actors, I think as part of the campaign to just take the heat somewhat off. And this has now triggered a very violent warfare between the two branches, and frankly, three branches of the Sinaloa cartel. Anyway, those are just supposition, but the US has three of the chapitos in custody. It has Ovidio, it has Joaquim, and it has El Mayo. And US law enforcement agents interrogating them will be able to ask, did they make any decisions on sending it less lethal fentanyl, reducing the purity and potency or not? And we would presumably have an answer. I would suggest that if US law enforcement action managed to drive the leadership of the Sinaloa cartel towards sending less potent fentanyl, that's an enormous win for US law enforcement.
By no means a criminal mastermind, but if I was at the head of an organization like that and you wanted to maintain your ability to operate and transfer, supply versus demand to supply this demand, which seems to be an never-ending cavernous, demand, and you consistently are killing people, that is, of course, going to get the attention of first friends and family, which is going to cascade back upstream and work its way up to politics. I mean, remains to be seen how the incoming administration is going to behave, but the new border czar, at least the one who was nominated, is pretty clear and direct on how he views the cartels and the threat to the United States, whether or not he's going to be able to action those things. For them to survive, especially when you're talking about military-related options in Mexico against the cartel, they're going to need to retreat a little bit away from that spotlight. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if they were having those conversations about how do we maintain our business? Maybe we give up a little bit of our market share, but maintain our business, but stay under the radar, because you just don't want to get on the radar of the United States.
Absolutely. And so, the cartels have been making those decisions about other violence through killings, right? Yep. No restraint in Mexico, where they fear Mexican law enforcement, not at all, including the Mexican military, and very nonviolent in the US. Our homicides predominantly come from city gang killings, but really do not have to do at all substantially with the Mexican cartels. Mm-hmm. But suspension of this constraint and calculation with respect to deaths from overdose. And yes, I mean, certainly many of the actors associated with the incoming Trump administration have been very much advocating the use of military action, unilateral military action into Mexico. I'm very skeptical that's a good idea, but nonetheless, this is something that has generated a lot of attention, and it's a consistent talking point. So much so that just yesterday, in early December, the Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum, stated that Mexico would not tolerate any kind of unilateral action. That's not a surprising position, but I think it's significant that she felt compelled to be out in public and say Mexico would not put up with the U.S. military action.
Attention warriors, are you ready to push your limits and become a stronger, more resilient version of yourself? We've teamed up with Mountain Tough Fitness Labs to deliver a fitness program designed for those who live by the creed of excellence. Whether you're active duty or a veteran or a hunter or just someone who's ready to tackle the challenges life throws at you, the Mountain Tough app is your battlefield for building mental toughness, physical strength, and it isn't just a workout program. It's a mission to forge you into a higher performing athlete, prepared for whatever comes next. We are so confident in this program that we're offering a full year on the app for just $120. Use the code CYBER50, that's all capital letters, all one word, at www.mountaintough.com. That breaks down to just 33 cents a day. Think about it this way. Investing in your fitness is one of the few things in your life that you can control. If you want to be the best, it starts right there. Dig in your truck seat, find the spare change, and commit to your mission of strength and resilience today. There is a redemption link down in the show notes, and the sale starts on the 22nd of November. And the promo code can only be used 1,000 times. First come, first serve. See you there. What's going on, everyone? This episode is also brought to you by Allegiance Gold. Recently, we've witnessed a surge in gold prices, reaching an all-time high of shy of $2,500. An impressive 20% increase in less than a year. In a market where traditional investments are increasingly scrutinized, gold and precious metals have emerged as compelling alternatives. You may ask, why should I invest in gold? Well, I'll give you a few reasons. Gold has long been valued for its stability and ability to preserve wealth across generations. It's a low-risk investment that provides security and balances out more volatile assets, especially during economic downturns. With the US dollar weakening due to rising national debt and inflation, gold acts as a reliable hedge, increasing in value when the cost of living spikes. Furthermore, it remains a crisis commodity that retains worth in times of geopolitical turmoil, as investors often turn to gold when global tensions rise. Finally, gold is a private, tangible asset, offering discretion and liquidity in a digital age prone to data breaches. If you are interested in learning more, go to protectwithandy.com today. Listeners of the show will get an exclusive lowest pricing on the market for select gold bars. That is protectwithandy.com. That'll be in the show notes. Or you can call 844-790-9191 to talk to an account representative. The link between the cartels and China, you mentioned earlier on that before China was largely sending over ready to go prepackaged fentanyl. Mm-hmm. And I've had a good amount of conversations with journalists who specialize in the cartel. And at some point in time, it shifted, and you mentioned it too, it shifted to becoming the base or source chemicals that they then cook inside of Mexico. How did the cartel, this relationship between the cartel and China, nobody really seems to be able to put a precise description on at what level inside of the Chinese government or even inside of the cartel or even the Mexican government, this relationship exists. I mean, it's clear that they are sending the source chemicals, and I'm sure they could say, oh, we didn't know that they were being combined to create fentanyl because maybe it's a base product for painting. I don't know, for putting together paint on your wall. But it is what it is. It is cooking. There are reports of, military-aged Chinese individuals at the docks facilitating the transfers over into the cartel. How did that, and even from the cartel perspective, how did they convince them to stop sending fentanyl and send the chemicals and allow Mexico or the cartels in Mexico to create it? It seems like it's a complicated and nuanced conversation between those two entities.
Yeah, so many things to dissect there. So first of all, look, there is no evidence that the government of China is sending either fentanyl or precursor. That has never been the case. So we really need to be very careful with the language. The actors who are sending fentanyl or precursors are Chinese brokers. They are not even very large Chinese medical or pharmaceutical or chemical companies. Most of these actors involved in the precursor business and originally fentanyl are smallish, perhaps mid-sized brokers, mid-sized producers. One reason being that especially precursors are extraordinarily cheap. It might be that tens of millions of dollars, 40, 30, 50, it's all that's necessary for the entire year's supply for US fentanyl market. This is how cheap the things are. You just don't make money on precursors of fentanyl. And for that matter, you don't really even on fentanyl unless you get access to the distribution. So if you can be supply the retail level, that's where you make your money.
Do you think that the Chinese government is aware that these precursors are being shipped?
Yes, absolutely. And so let me get to that, right? So the issue of how does the Chinese government act to stop the supply of precursors from Chinese brokers and Chinese chemical companies, and previously fentanyl, has really been at the core of US-China law enforcement diplomacy since the Obama administration. So at first, when it was direct supply from China to the US, the Obama administration and later on the Trump administration started engaging China to schedule the entire class of fentanyl. I mentioned earlier in our conversation that synthetic drugs are extraordinarily convenient for drug traffickers. And one reason why they are very convenient is that changing just a very small part of the chemical formula is sufficient to have a different formula that is no longer scheduled, but it still retains all the effects. That's very hard to do with cocaine or heroin.
Yeah.
So, the Obama administration would get the Chinese government to schedule this analog of fentanyl. The Chinese government would do it. The traders would just slightly tweak the formula. The Obama administration would go and say, okay, here is another analog, schedule this analog. The government of China would do it. Now, eventually, the diplomacy becomes about scheduling the whole class of fentanyl. Now, this is a significant ask because all international regulations actually state, the international laws and treaties, as well as domestic legislations, actually state that drugs are scheduled by the specific physical formula. So as the Trump administration imposes the tariff war on China, as part of the geostrategic economic bargaining, China finally agrees that it will change its laws and becomes the first country in the world to permanently change its laws to schedule the entire class of fentanyl. This happens in 2018. And when that happens, we see a big drop of shipments from fentanyl to the United States, fentanyl from China to the United States. Mm-hmm. So the legislation goes into effect on May 1st, 2019. China changes the laws. All of fentanyl is scheduled, and the direct supply comes to very low levels. But the adaptation that the smuggling networks then move to is to be selling precursors, most of which are unscheduled, and most of which are widely used in just any basic chemistry, pharmaceutical sectors, and start selling them to the Mexican cartels. Now, for a long time, the Chinese government would say, look, we cannot act against those companies because the drugs are not scheduled. They are legal. There is no restraints on how they can be traded. And of course, the companies would say, we don't know that we are selling to Mexican cartels. They do know, and we have plenty of evidence that they complicitly engage in what they know will become an illegal product. They will send formulas along with the chemicals. This is how you take them, and this is how you mix it into the fentanyl, right?
Yeah.
But China does make this big overture and expects the Trump administration to reduce the tariffs. It thinks that's the payoff for changing the laws. And the Trump administration doesn't do it. So China waits into the Biden administration and expects the Biden administration to reduce the tariffs or do away with the tariffs. The Biden administration doesn't do it, and in fact ramps up tensions in alliances, technology, military, the push to confront China's and strategic competition really enters new domains and new scales. And we see the bilateral relationship by 2021, 2022 very significantly plummeting. And China turns off the law enforcement cooperation, including on fentanyl, and finally announces publicly that it stopped cooperation on fentanyl and on law enforcement after then Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi visits Taiwan in August 2022. But frankly, the cooperation had really stopped before.
Yeah.
Then we have a year of negotiations in which you have both very adroit US diplomacy that does create all kinds of pressure points on China, multilateral as well as bilateral, as well as the intensity of the tension between the countries reaching such a point that both countries want to stabilize the relationship. They don't want it to just be sinking and sinking. And so they identify certain areas, AI, climate, and fentanyl, as well as mill-to-mill, as possibilities for collaboration. And so across 2024, we see actually a very significant increase in US-China law enforcement cooperation on fentanyl, resulting in arrest of Chinese nationals, Chinese money laundering actors, cracking down on some of the companies. Is it perfect? Hardly. Right, I'd say we went maybe from 0 to somewhere half on an imaginary dial of cooperation.
Yeah.
But we are not at 0. But there is still one, well, there are many outstanding issues and challenging issues, but one of them is precisely this problem of Chinese brokers selling to the cartels. And the fact that many of these chemicals are legal, they're not scheduled. They don't, not only are they legal, there are no restraints on them. So you hear the Chinese sellers constantly using this excuse that they don't know who their customers are. And China doesn't have any know your customers laws that would mandate due diligence, nor does it have conspiracy and material support clauses. So, if I were in the United States, were to provide any kind of material assistance to a DTO, a drug trafficking group, or a terrorist group, I will face the vast set of US laws that are very large, carry huge penalties, conspiracy laws, racketeering laws, material support clauses laws. China has none of these. So it cannot try people on the basis of this. And so it's been one of the real issues in the US-China collaboration. How do you get Chinese law enforcement? How do you enable Chinese law enforcement to be prosecuting people who are conspiring with criminals, but doing so with legal chemicals? Much yet to be done in that space. China has been actually quite creative in the last few weeks in finding ways to charge people to get around those problems, but it is a very significant challenge in the law enforcement relationship. And China wants its payoffs. It didn't get from the Biden administration. And I was just in China. I was in Mexico prior to that, after US elections. And certainly what I was hearing from Chinese officials is that if the Trump administration were to impose extensive tariffs like the 60% tariff or fentanyl-linked tariffs, that this would likely not allow for any continuation or any substantial continuation of the cooperation.
We don't just do the filmmaking. We do everything. We've taken a case study of over 30 projects that we've done over the past 15 years, and we put together what we believe is the most effective and efficient content funnel for brands. They need content on a daily basis. They need to be talking to authentic end users. We want your team to bring its most challenging problems and allow us and our team to apply our proven methods to your brand to take it to another level.
If we take it downstream a little bit more, so let's say these chemicals are arriving in Mexico, China's doing what they can or they aren't, depending on which administration they're working with. We go into Mexico. What ability does the Mexican government have to interrupt these laboratories where these are being cooked? I mean, there was a recent New York Times investigation that found that cartels are trying to lure people out of college chemistry courses.
Yeah.
I mean, and guess what? They're offering large sums of money. I understand the enticement to do that. You have the background knowledge and experience.
I have even a more interesting tidbit, which is that some of the Mexican cartels, I was told several years ago in places like Morelia, were recruiting social scientists to be doing canvassing and polling because the cartels
doesn't surprise me at all. Yeah,
rule people's territory institutions in Mexico. Mexico is on the verge of being a narco state. But anyway, what capacity does the government of China have? I mean,
A government in Mexico. Yeah, I'm curious if we go downstream from China.
Very, very, very limited, right?
Yeah.
And that's because law enforcement capacities are extraordinarily collapsed as well as corrupt.
Yeah.
The power of criminal groups, drug trafficking groups in Mexico has grown enormously, particularly over the past 6 years when the Mexican government was under the president of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who essentially gave the cartels a carte blanche. He believed that if he pulled back law enforcement and kind of just the minimum necessary placation of the US with the odd lab busted, the odd arrest of a high-value target, the cartels would settle their territories and violence would go down in Mexico. That was his objective. That didn't happen. Violence stayed at the same level or increased during his 6 years in office. And the cartels not just expanded into very many criminal economies, but crucially expanded in dramatic ways into legal economies. For example, agriculture extractives are really permeated by cartel activity, and not just by charging extortion, but by really controlling vertical supply chains, ordering competition, whether they can harvest, whether they can sell, whether they can export without their permission. Meanwhile, Mexico has for decades struggled with the immense corruption of law enforcement actors, as well as the Mexican military, and efforts to purge out the corruption would never pan out systematically. You would have just every administration coming in trying to do anti-corruption, judicial, law enforcement reforms, and it would fall flat. So, we are today in perhaps the worst state of the power of the Mexican state vis-a-vis the criminal groups. And I'm not prone to drama. I don't love the term narco-state. I don't often use it. But in this case, I do genuinely believe that the capacity to rule of the Mexican state is hugely diminished, and much rule is conducted by the criminal groups. So, instigating much more will and interest from the Mexican government to take on the criminal groups and reverse their power, not to have people, politicians, economists live under the tyranny of the narcos is crucial. And we have some hope in the Sheinbaum administration. The Sheinbaum administration took office in Mexico on October 1st. And although Claudia Sheinbaum is a close student, mentee, acolyte of former President López Obrador, she actually rolled out a surprisingly robust, multifaceted security agenda. That was a surprise to me. Was quite in contrast with her campaign on the security issue. How she would implement, would she have the resources, capacities, wherewithal, who knows? But at least on paper, the plan was far greater than anything that AMLO put on during the 6 years. But meanwhile, they've been grappling with various challenges, the war in Sinaloa being one of them. And of course, this is now sitting in the center of bargaining with the incoming, or will be at the center of bargaining, will be at the center of incoming Trump administration. And here is where I am skeptical about the military option deeply, and I actually think it will be quite counterproductive. So certainly the US has the capacity to bomb some labs. Now, many labs are no longer in the mountains. They will be in urban spaces. There are, of course, big risks of killing civilians, and not just through the impact of the explosion, but if fentanyl is released, you can kill people through the spread of the chemicals. So, you cannot be killing many Mexican people in this way.
Yeah.
And you can do high-value targeting by special operations forces against some of the famous narco leaders. But they have been doing that, or not the US directly, but the Mexican government through US support and instigation has been doing that since the Calderon era. Even the AMLO people would every so often arrest someone like Ovidio and hand it over to us. What we really need is a much more sustained joint effort that targets the entire structure of the criminal organization. That is not just this one-off odd bust labs here, odd lab busted here, odd high-value criminal targeted. The replenishment capacity to generate leadership has been extraordinary. You have scores and scores of actors being taken from the top leaderships of the groups, and it leads to fragmentation, infighting, but also just resurrection of new structures. And so I think that we have an opportunity to define US-Mexico collaboration in a way that recognizes the need of Mexico to reduce violence, that helps Mexico recover sovereignty, and that does it in a way that is sustainable bilaterally. The AMLO era, when the narcos were given the carte blanche, was a bad era, and the US law enforcement was completely in the freezer at the time. We don't want to be in that position. If we send special operations forces to arrest some high-value targets, say Alfredo, he's one of the Chapitos, well, the Mexican government will completely kick us out. We can, unilaterally breach the border so many times, but the payoff is very limited in terms of the impact on the trade and the cartels, and the costs are enormously high for the bilateral relationship. Instead, what we should be asking is to go back to where we were during the Calderon era, where we had vast numbers of US law enforcement agents across Mexico being able to be part of on-the-ground operations, at least in an observer role, being able to be part of joint fusion intelligence centers, so that we also have eyes and can prompt some of the necessary cleanup of law enforcement and military institutions in Mexico. This is a very hard task. The Mexican government doesn't want it. But this is what I would be focusing my diplomacy on, not the satisfaction of a missile strike, but on bringing US law enforcement back in a sustainable way to Mexico, and telling the Mexican government, this is not just for us. This is not only a payoff for tariffs. This is in the interest of your state, your people.
In your 20 years of living among and looking into these illicit markets, what's the most effective thing that you have seen that actually changed the trajectory in these markets? Has there been any one thing or a few things that have worked?
In terms of policy?
In terms of policy or even actions. I mean, I've been hearing about the war on drugs since I was literally a child. And we certainly keep pumping money into it. And, I think the jury is probably not out anymore as to whether or not it has been incredibly effective. And I'm just curious, in your experience, what have you seen that has actually worked?
So we need to kind of get, I think, below what are the objectives that we're trying to achieve. And I would outline several objectives. One is we want to save lives. So we don't want people to be dying from overdose, and we don't want their lives to be ruined by using drugs. Many people who use drugs will use drugs without having adverse effect on their health or on their social life, on their employment capacities, on their family life. But some 20% will develop a chronic illness that will be enormously destructive to their lives and the lives of their families. We want that number to be as low as possible. So what we for sure know that doesn't work is imprisoning users. Doesn't help anything. Imprisoning dealers, non-violent dealers, doesn't really help anything very much either. So what works is getting people access to medically sound, evidence-based treatment. So why are we having the overdose deaths finally going down? Narcan, buprenorphine, access to medication, access to medical insurance that allows people to have access to medication. People often say, well, why don't you just reduce demand? Reducing demand is actually really, really hard. But there are many components to reducing demand, one of which is being able to get people to treatment. That means being able to get insurance for people to have treatment.
I'm going to add as well, something I've heard from my law enforcement friends, testing kits, people's ability to actually test what it is that they think they're using.
Not all users will do it, but
Correct, but it's a
do.
tool. It
But
is a
if they
tool.
do,
At least you
they-
know what you're getting into, or don't.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, I think so. Much sounder and expansive approach to treatment. Along with that comes something that has long been very taboo in the U.S. harm reduction. This would be things like testing kits. This falls under the rubric of harm reduction, and for a long time, U.S. policy was deadly opposed to it. On the law enforcement side, there are law enforcement really important gains and successes of law enforcement. What hasn't worked is stopping the supply.
Yeah.
Maybe we are now in a situation where there is some reduction in supply. Maybe the supply that's being sent is less pure. What has worked in Western countries, however, and for that matter in East Asian countries with very brutal and excessive law enforcement, in my view, is reducing violence. So just, back to the Mexico-US contrast, Mexican cartels, very violent in Mexico, including in legal economies, very nonviolent in the US. So we need to preserve that core focus of law enforcement, of tempering down the behavior. You can smuggle contraband that's bad. You smuggle contraband that results in deaths, whether it's because it's so potent or because you are so violent, then we will smash you. So I think having this nuanced picture of where law enforcement comes in is an important element of how to get better results. And then, there's lots of nuance to it that I'm afraid I don't have time to get into because I have another thing in 5 minutes. But I would, strategies like how do you design law enforcement in Mexico? An enormously complex question now when you have such powerful narcos and so collapse the state. But I would suggest that for any of your listeners who are interested in details on the law enforcement side, treatment side, harm reduction, what's happening with the US market, I've been hosting a podcast show called The Killing Drugs, and that has many episodes now that explore many of these issues.
Hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to learn more or hear more from Vanda, she mentioned it in the show. She hosts the Killing Drugs podcast. You can find it anywhere you find your podcasts. Thank you again for listening to Change Agents, an Ironclad original presented by Firecracker Farm. See you all next week with a new episode and a new guest. See you then.